In recent sections, we've considered how human goodness, insight, and character can be cultivated both through individual practices and through a transformation of the cultural scaffolding that goes into the construction and support of our minds. Given that we are symbolic beings and that human evil can take place in the symbolic domain, it is generally the case that symbolic modes of harm to human life, and indeed to life in general, must be fought in the domain of symbols as well. That is, efforts to guide human behavior toward that which fosters human life and does not harm it, and that which fosters life in general and does not harm it, must take into account the symbolic systems that afford harm to human life and life in general. A focus on individual human action is not enough. Ideas can drive people to reshape the world. Thinkers have played a crucial role throughout history in shaping the ideas that can reshape the world. This is as true now as it ever was, although it may seem that some thinkers in recent decades have taken refuge in purely academic problems, or worse, pushed for a kind of nihilism that denies moral responsibility or causal role for consciousness and its deliberations. As an advocate of libertarian free will, I believe we can and should use our free will to make the world a better place. But a sober look at the world as it is now makes apparent just how much work needs to be done. Even setting aside the potential horrors of nuclear war and environmental collapse, I believe the world is heading towards turmoil as it becomes increasingly clear to more and more people that our governments are being controlled by institutional entities that serve their interests rather than those of the people. The new tyranny is not King George, but international corporations that have taken over our governments such that they no longer serve the people, but instead serve the corporations.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Taking power back to the people will require a new set of ideas to overthrow this new kind of tyranny. I also believe that we can all play a role in the emerging movement to return human institutions to ones that benefit human well-being based on the traditions and lessons of the age of reason. I believe we are seeing the first stirrings of a Reenlightenment as the latest incarnation of the ancient Greek impulse to base life and society on reason rather than arbitrary and self-interested power. I have argued that information is downwardly causal in the brain. Since brains collectively agree to obey rules, an abstract entity or process such as a corporation, a game, or a government can be downwardly causal. This means that an institution can realize, via the intermediation of human decisions to act according to institutional rules, an informational causal chain that follows those rules. This means that human freedom can be constrained to the point of elimination by institutions that themselves do not think and cannot feel. Human freedom is not only about individual choice. It's about individual choice within socially and institutionally constrained rules. This gives rise to the pressing question of the meta-human morality of actions carried out by humans done according to the rules of institutions. Let me give an example of how problematic this has become for our world. Let's say John is the CEO of one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world. After an unusually severe hurricane that would cost shareholders billions, company lawyers find ways to get out of fully indemnifying client corporations who are themselves trying to get out of fully paying businesses and homeowners. The CEO's son, who's interning for a year, confronts his father with the wrongness of what's happening. After much emotion, the CEO explains that he would never do this himself, but if he didn't, the trustees would replace him, so he's just doing his job, which is to maximize profits by all means allowed. The son confronts the trustees, who each say the same. In the end, nothing stops this immorality because it's all legal. although everyone involved would not act this way as an individual moral agent, and all agree in person that it is immoral. This can be thought of as meta-evil that leaves individuals feeling helpless as people get hurt by what other people do because they are obeying rules designed to maximize profits and power for their institutions rather than maximize common human well-being. Institutions themselves are amoral, but their acts, if done by an individual, would count as moral, immoral, good, or evil. Institutions such as the military, industrial, financial complex and transnational corporations have given rise to new forms of impersonal evil that have proven extremely difficult to rein in by individuals. These institutions have taken on a life of their own and might even seem to have a psychopathic personality if we were to anthropomorphize them. A recurring theme in the history of most complex civilizations is the attempt by the people to dismantle excessive concentrations of wealth and power. When masses of individuals end up with too little and powers wielded by oligarchs become too tyrannical, people confront power. Sometimes concentrated power is so unyielding that a revolution will begin, as in late 18th century America and France. Sometimes concentrated power yields, short of revolution. The 1911 dismantling of Standard Oil into numerous smaller companies, which later became Exxon, Amoco, Chevron, and Mobil, under the 1893 Sherman Antitrust Act was an example of the power the people can have over oligarchical institutions and ultimately over the self-serving individuals and families who control them. The supreme law of the United States was constructed in a sweltering room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. It was the peak of the Enlightenment, before the cataclysm of the French Revolution of 1789, whose goals were to rid the world of irrationality, arbitrary authority, and excessive concentrations of power through the application of reason. This social movement, with roots in classical Greece and the Renaissance, started with Bacon and Descartes, respectively, founders of modern science and modern philosophy. The movement gained momentum with the ideas of philosophers such as Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza, Hutcheson, Hume, Smith, Reid, Kant, and many scientists, foremost among them Isaac Newton. It took a turn toward social transformation with the ideas of Montesquieu, Voltaire, the philosophes, and eventually Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, and many others. The central idea that Madison and others framed in our Constitution was Montesquieu's idea of separating governmental powers so that the purse, sword, judge, and lawgiver were divided and could keep each other in check. What Madison, Jefferson, and Montesquieu did not foresee was that external powers could come to control the whole governmental system of checks and balances. These powers could control executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government such that the government would no longer serve the people, but instead serve the interests of those external powers. What has this Enlightenment blind spot led to? A military, industrial, intelligence, and financial complex functions as an unelected deep state behind the democratically elected government. It does what it wants, regardless of the laws obeyed by the people, the NSA's mass surveillance being a recent example. Wall Street and too-big-to-fail banks, namely Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Morgan Stanley, have captured our government to serve their interests rather than the people's. They have instituted a money system that is based on the issuance of debt, so-called fractional reserve banking or lending, that requires ever-increasing debt levels to function. Money, which should be a symbol representing work or something of inherent value that can be stored as potential work or value, instead represents debt and can be digitally created out of thin air by a Federal Reserve central bank that serves the interests of the banks who are its primary shareholders. The ability to concoct units of money that people will then work for gives those who get the money first, namely the big banks, incredible and unfair power over our society. As this concocted money works its way through the system, it diminishes the value of money as more money chases the same amount of goods. But if money diminishes in its symbolic value to represent work or production, it will eventually lead to a crisis in the currency as people lose faith in its capacity to exchange for work and things of value. Indeed, the creation of the Federal Reserve that is controlled by private banks guarantees that their interests will be served first, as the recent massive taxpayer bailouts of the banks prove. In fact, the institutionalization of the Fed in 1913 can be regarded as a soft coup that put the power of the financial controllers of the Fed at the heart of our governmental decision-making apparatus, regardless of how the people feel about it. In addition, there is a runaway feedback loop in place now as Wall Street can buy out judges and politicians through such legalized bribery as lobbying, campaign donations, gifts, and job offers, such that laws are created and enforced or not enforced to benefit Wall Street. This manifests itself as increasing concentration of power and wealth for the top few percent of the population and increasing poverty for the masses. Resentment and prospects of revolution are hindered by controlling mass media, maintaining programs like food stamps that feed close to 50 million people in the U.S., and nipping any popular Occupy movements in the bud. Where is all this going? The momentum is on the side of institutions that control governments that now serve those institutions. And this means greater concentration of power and wealth in the hands of those who control institutions that have no loyalty to countries or their peoples. Taken to an extreme, this will lead to a deep state run by international financiers, accountable to no one and to no nation, who control a world currency, perhaps digital, that only they can produce at will to get indebted serfs to do their work. We, the people, will be cut out until we take the government back, as the muckrakers and Teddy Roosevelt did over 100 years ago, and as Andrew Jackson did 70 years before that. If there was ever a time where free will was needed to extricate ourselves from systems of control, now is that time. What can be done? Corporate rights have been extended in a way that shields individuals from blame for acts done in the name of the corporation. Not a single banker went to jail for the rampant fraud and forgery, remember robo-signing, that led to the financial meltdown. If people don't get punished for acts of institutional evil that they facilitated, not only will moral hazard and institutional psychopathy grow, the people will revolt eventually and cut off bankers' heads. But it lies within our power to dislodge the corporate takeover of our governments. It lies within our power to return society to the rule of law that no one, not even top bankers, should be above. A second American Revolution can be avoided. There are mechanisms in place that have yet to be tried. Absurd Supreme Court decisions that enshrine corporations as individuals or guarantee secret money donations as free speech can be overridden by the people. Constitutional amendments can force the definition of free speech to mean free human speech and human writing, and can take away the rights of corporations to count as human individuals before the law. We can break the feedback loop that allows corporations to purchase judges and our representatives. We can begin, for example, by pushing for a new, tougher version of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act that was repealed at the behest of the big banks in 1999 that allowed banks to become gambling houses, whose profits they privatized and whose bad bets were and will be shoved on us.
On derivatives, yeah, I think they were wrong, and I think I was wrong to take it. Because the argument on derivatives was that these things are expensive and sophisticated, and only a handful of investors will buy them. And they don't need any extra protection and any extra transparency. The money they're putting up guarantees them transparency. And the flaw in that argument was that, first of all, sometimes people with a lot of money make stupid decisions and make it without transparency. And secondly, the most important flaw was, even if less than 1% of the total investment community is involved in derivatives exchanges, so much money was involved that if they went bad, they could affect 100% of the investments, and indeed 100% of the citizens in countries, not investors. And I was wrong about that.
We can push to dismantle or weaken the Federal Reserve in the say of Goldman Sachs and other for-profit private interests in its decision-making. We can push for money that represents things of inherent value rather than someone's debts, and that cannot be printed out of thin air. A re-enlightenment is brewing, and the shapers of ideas have a central role to play. Will philosophers and scientists again play a central role in fashioning a better world, or will we succumb to the temptations of purely academic debates, or worse, moral nihilism? Those who believe they lack free will not likely be motivated to try to change that which they view as inevitable or beyond their control. It will be those who act on the conviction of free will who will take on the giant task of confronting the central societal issues of our time, namely, breaking the positive feedback loop where the rich are getting richer and the middle class relatively poorer. It will be those convinced of their free will who will fight for having a say in the matter of what happens to them in this life and how they will be governed.